Great. Welcome to our podcast or show. So Professor Kimberly Clausing from UCLA. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So yeah, it's our great pleasure. So indeed, I understand that you teach tax law at UCLA, and you also given so many talks this, and I think all of us, at least me myself, I've been listening to many of your past interviews. So very, very captivating and interesting, especially now that everyone's talking about trade, right? So let's get going. Your book that you published, if I could show here on the screen, opened in 2019. So why don't you take us through a little bit? What are your main arguments?
So Open is the main title of the book, and the subtitle is called The Progressive Case for Free Trade, Immigration, and Global Capital. And the punchline of the book is that fundamentally, free trade and immigration and global connections between countries are in the interest of the working class, not just the elites, but regular everyday people. And so I begin by acknowledging that sometimes in the United States, the middle class, elements of the middle class and the poorer populations can feel left behind, like some of their economic outcomes are disappointing. And that's a real problem, and that's partly due to income inequality, and that has a lot of sources, and I talk about some of those in the book. Technological change is an important one, but there's also been changes in laws and rising market power of companies and declining unionization, and there's been a bunch of other things that have also caused discontent. But one prominent, wing of thought blames both trading partners and immigrants for these developments and says, oh, the reason that some people in the United States are hurting is because of trade or because of immigration. And that's very much the Trumpian philosophy.
Right.
So the book asks two questions. One, is that true? But two, regardless of the answer to that first question, what is the best way to help people who are feeling left behind? And the answer to the first question is trade comes with some ups and downs, but isn't predominantly responsible for what's going on. There's a lot of other causal factors. But I think the more important question is if people are suffering, what do you do about it? And the problem with putting on tariffs and kicking out immigrants, and we're doing both of those things right now, is it actually hurts the very people that you're trying to help. Consumers, when they go to the store, they see things are more expensive. It's like a big tax increase for them. But it also hurts them in their workplaces, because when they are trying to sell their products on world markets, their goods are going to be less likely to be received happily in foreign countries. If we're also putting tariffs on goods, foreigners are going to either retaliate or have less positive views of US products. But also the supply chain disruption that happens when you tariff intermediate goods, and the majority of US goods are intermediate goods, means that it's kind of hurting people as workers too. So I kind of go through why it is that freer trade is actually better for workers. And it's even more the case with immigration. Immigrants are a huge complement to American workers. They help American workers. They create demand for American workers. They're really useful in our economy. Some of our best firms have been founded by immigrants, and we'd be unwise to turn our back on the talent of the world like we're doing now. So the question is, if you've got these worries and you're not going to blame immigration and trade, and you think, in fact, that restricting those things will make things worse, what do you do for people? And so at the end of the book, I argue that a better approach would be to focus on things like redistributing through the tax system. So if you've really done well, and your company is really successful, and you've got all this highly valued stock and your wages are really high, maybe you pay a bit more tax. But that helps fund a safety net, that helps fund education, that helps fund health insurance access for those who feel left behind. And we give people kind of more levers and ways to get ahead in their lives. And that can include everything from adequate infrastructure to education and all of that. But you're going to need a tax base to pay for that. So that means kind of using the tax system and the role of government to help the people who feel left behind, rather than sort of adding insult to injury by taxing them more and removing a source of vitality from the US economy. So that's kind of the major lesson there.
Right. Thank you very much. So it seems like it's always easy to blame somebody else for everything.
Yes.
Anyway, within that context, because basically, I know that your book was written back in 2017, and by that time, we already know that the the feeling anti-globalization had already picked up, right? So I would suggest, I would think, okay, because of that, maybe that's why Kim put out a book and say, yo, whatever happens, whatever the noise, we have to be open. But within that context, do you think the characterization, anti-globalist view, anti-globalization or globalization myth, as some people have said, is that true, or is it too much of an argument?
So I think we should distinguish kind of the United States from the rest of the world here. So the rest of the world shows very little interest on average on giving up on international markets. I think if you look at a country like China that's seen hundreds of millions of people go from poverty to being well off, if you look at a country like India, who's seen when they're more open, they can also do better. You know, there's example after example of countries that have realized that they benefit from being part of the world economy. And I think Cambodia is one of those as well. So, you know, you've got a bunch of countries who are trying to continue to be part of this system to, in fact, liberalize trade sometimes with other countries. And what we saw the European Union do, for instance, in reaction to the first Trump administration, to do new trade deals with other countries. And we see Canada and the members of the comprehensive and progressive, the CPTPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. We see members of them and RCEP and all these other groups that are trying to liberalize, in fact, and not move away from trade. And I think that's in part because the real lived experience in countries that are open is just better than the experience in countries that are closed. And you don't have to look any further than Korea. You've got the example, North Korea closed, South Korea open. Like, which one would you rather live in? So I think that's one attitude. And then in the United States, I think part of this is a matter of perception. I think we're in a very divided country right now. One party that narrowly won an election, and the Trump victory in this last election, he won by fewer votes than Hillary Clinton won by in 2016. When you look at her vote margin over his, he got into presidency because of the Electoral College, not because of the votes. She won by more than he did this time. So it's a very close election, and the half of the country that voted for Trump, I think, often bought into this idea that, oh, we're getting a bad deal somehow. We should retreat from this prior way of doing things. But I don't think that means the whole country bought into that. In fact, I think even some of the people who voted for Trump don't really buy into that. And we're about to have a big economics lesson in the United States. It's trickling in slowly, but I think people are going to see that this experiment is going to make their lives worse off. It's going to make things more expensive. It's going to hurt manufacturing employment. It already has. It's going to potentially create stagflationary headwinds that hurt the economy through a combination of higher prices and reduced economic activity. So I think once people learn that lesson, you know, we don't know where the United States is going to end up, but I wouldn't say that it's predetermined that we'll always be a protectionist country. I'm hopeful that we can move past it in a few years, but you know, it's partly a question of whether the word gets out from journalists and efforts, you know, like your own podcast, even to sort of reach people and help them connect the dots between their experiences and these abstract ideas.
Right. Thank you. I guess because sometimes we hear people talk about, you know, yes, our globalization is good, trade need to be open, but then there are studies that say, although we all love globalization, but at the end of the day, usually, although your customers could be at the end of, you know, the other end of the world, but the making of things usually happen within the area. So, which is why some people would say, globalization is perhaps it's not that true after all, because at the end, the making of things happen to be around you, like within a travelable distance. So, what do you say to that?
I think when you look at most economies, there's a big chunk of what we buy, a big share of our income that goes to things that are inherently non-traded. If I get a haircut, or if I go to the restaurant, or I send my kids to school, like buying services is always local. But I think trying to do everything in your economy yourself is a recipe for poverty. Like if we try to produce every single thing ourselves in the United States, we'll be a poorer country, and even more so in a small country, because in a small country, let's say you're, a country the size of Costa Rica, and you're trying to make every single thing yourself. Are you supposed to make cars and planes and lipstick and wine? Like, I mean, how are you supposed to make all of the things that somebody might want in one little country? So the gains from are very real. And I think countries shut themselves off from these gains at their peril. We're not really embracing complete autarky in the United States now, but we are putting these huge taxes on that trade. And what that does is it really destroys some of the gains from trade, because it causes us to do things we're probably not that good at instead of things that might better be suited to, and we'll actually lose export markets at the same time that we're starting to make these new things that we shouldn't be making.
Right. So I guess now, if I hear you correctly, because with the now Mr. Trump's second administration altogether talking about tariff and all that, so we see rebalancing everywhere. And so what do you say to that? Is Mr. Trump part of the solution, or is somehow some sort of his policies is worsening the situation?
Yeah, so this balancing that people talk about, they're often talking about the global, for the country as a whole, how much are you importing relative to your exports? That's your, sometimes referred to as the trade balance or the current account balance. And there's a flip side of that, which is this financial account balance, which is how much people are investing in your country. The United States has been running these really big current account deficits, which means we're attracting a lot of foreign investment at the same time in an equal and offsetting way. Why is that? Well, it's because we don't really save that much as a country, and the federal government is a big part of that, because they run a deficit that's about 6% of GDP in size. And so every year they're borrowing. So you could say, okay, well, if you're really worried about these imbalances, maybe the thing to do is run a smaller budget deficit, not a bigger one, because then you won't need to borrow so much from the rest of the world. And the way you borrow from the rest of the world is by importing more than you're exporting, right? Like that's the only way you can consume more than you make is by running a trade deficit. So as a country, we're continuously consuming more than we make, and we're then blaming the people selling the stuff to us. It would make more sense to look from within and say, okay, if you're unhappy with this imbalance, you've got a tool. It's called the budget deficit. Stop cutting taxes and address that situation. And in fact, the Trump administration has gone in the opposite direction of expanding the budget deficit through their policies as a whole, right? So I think it's hard to take seriously their concern for these imbalances. Now, the United States isn't the only one with an imbalance. There's some countries that you might argue have the opposite problem, that maybe they save too much. And so they're kind of putting too much money out into this world economy. And so they're part of the imbalance problem too. But it's difficult to control other countries, right? Even when you browbeat them and insist that they have these negotiations with you, are you really changing their behavior, or are you just encouraging them to say some nice things to you to hope that things won't be as bad, right? It's easier to address your own behavior, and we're the biggest source of our deficit, and we have an easy solution if we had the courage to use it. It's just easier to blame foreigners than to put our own house in order.
Right. How about the argument that says, in the last couple of months, by putting tariff on imports, they make a lot of money, a lot of revenue. But what would you say to that? Because to really get revenue from tariff probably doesn't make a lot of sense, because by that time you would have to raise it so much that your own local companies will die, and then the other source of income, which is the corporate income, and all of that will just go to zero. And well, so the argument that you could make money out of tariff doesn't really sound very good to you, does it?
Well, some revenue comes in, and you can't fault them for that. Like, it's true, revenue is coming in. It's just a really inefficient tax, and it's not enough revenue to pay for all these tax cuts they've done. So you kind of extrapolate out and you say, okay, they're going to collect, maybe if they're lucky, $2 trillion in revenue over a decade. But they just cut $4 trillion worth of taxes in a different place. So they're still digging a bigger hole. They're not filling in the hole. Right. So, and they're digging it in a way that's really quite harmful, because it's destroying gains from trade. It's hurting manufacturing, and it's a regressive tax. By regressive, I mean this tax hurts poorer and middle income class people more than it hurts rich people, for the simple reason that they have to spend all their income. Like, if you're a rich person, you can save, a third or half of your income, right? And that part doesn't feel the tariff. But if you're a poor person, you have to spend all of your income, and a lot of it's on stuff that might be imported or would substitute for what would be imported. You're going to see the whole burden of the tariff, as opposed to just the part that you're not saving, because you're not saving anything if you're a poor person in the United States. Their saving rates are really low.
Right. So on the manufacturing jobs, right? So we hear that a lot.
Yeah, you do.
So that we can bring back manufacturing jobs home. So maybe there's some truth to that, but maybe not that true after all. What do you say to that?
I agree with you. I mean, I think if you look across countries, as they get richer, they have fewer manufacturing jobs. This is even true in China. You can see technology replacing some of the jobs as China gets richer. This has been true in many countries as they get richer.
Right.
So the Trump administration has this fantasy that they're going to go back in time, and suddenly we're going to be making things like steel, and I don't know, Model Ts or whatever they're imagining us making in the past. But their approach, even if that were their goal, is actually hurting that that vision, because they are tariffing everything. And more than half of what the United States imports is an intermediate good that goes into something else, right? So if you're telling a business person that might be making, a product that has some foreign parts, and then they're selling it again, that they're going to be competitive when you're increasing their costs at the same time that you're drying up their markets, right? That is actually going to hurt US production, because US firms are going to be paying more for things like steel and, all the inputs that go into making things. And we saw this already. There's been a lot of really careful studies of the first Trump administration tariffs. And we saw that they were bad for manufacturing job creation, because even though there was a small, almost indiscernible increase in the industries that were protected, there were other industries that used goods that now had these higher tariffs on them, and they lost jobs at a faster rate than the first set of industries was getting jobs. And the retaliation also hurts here, because other countries retaliate, and we've seen this with the Chinese and the Canadians and others, right? So it doesn't make sense to think that you're going to get manufacturing jobs unless you're way more strategic than these people are being. And they're not being strategic. They're just putting tariffs on almost as if it were random or based on the personal, vibe of, the negotiation of the day. Korea is a nice example. Like, Korea had a free trade agreement with the United States. They already were giving us the best possible treatment, and now they have to pay a tariff despite having negotiated this agreement. Brazil is another good example. They're getting an especially high tariff just because of a political point that Trump wants to make about the Bolsonaro prosecution. So it seems very unstrategic.
Right. So I guess if we were to ask people on the street, do you want some manufacturing jobs back home? I'd probably say yes. But then if you ask, do you really want to work in factories? No. I guess maybe most people would just want to do like design, marketing, rather than the making of stuff itself, right?
And that's what's so silly about this, right? Like, I don't think a lot of people in the United States really want their kids to grow up to work in tire factories. Like, they'd much rather be designers, right, of cars, or marketers, or financiers, or research and development teams, things like that. And, if we're unhappy about the trade balance, like I said, there's a solution to that, which is to borrow less, right?
Right.
And that would naturally rebalance some of the things as it is. But I think asking to make lower value things is a silly thing. Like, I mean, we even have tariffs on bananas and coffee. Like, do we really want to start up banana plantations? Like, it makes no sense to tariff some of these things. Our only source of coffee is on one Hawaiian island. Like, I mean, it really doesn't make any sense to tax those things.
Right. But what would you say to those people who are really hurting, some particular communities in the US that have been suffering? Sure, maybe we cannot help everybody, but what would be the best approach to go about, reassuring those people that, no, it's not the end of the world. This is certain things that government can do. What could that be?
Yeah, so one example that I look at in the book is the example of Pittsburgh. And if you know anything about Pittsburgh at all, it's a place in Pennsylvania. You might have heard Pittsburgh Steelers, which is a sports team that's named after the commodity steel, right? So like Pittsburgh had this reputation of being sort of a steel-based community.
Right.
It got hurt decades ago by the fact that the US has lost steel competitiveness. We're not getting that back. Like, even with sky-high tariffs, steel employment has been nearly flat. But Pittsburgh has done well nonetheless. Pittsburgh has had a lot of growth, for instance, in the biomedical sector. The universities have partnered with businesses. There's been investments in infrastructure and housing. And the government has played a role in creating some of those public goods, things like infrastructure and transportation and community colleges and things like that, that go with all of this learning and this development of these new industries, right? So if you go to Pittsburgh today, you don't see steel mills. You see a lot of, pretty successful people in pretty high-tech jobs. And I think that's a success story. And I think what other cities could learn is what the government can do is help invest in fundamentals, things like education, community college infrastructure, and also can provide ladders and reassurance to people who may not be able to always get the best job to replace the one that they lost.
Right.
So one example would be the earned income tax credit, which subsidizes the wages of lower income workers. This is a way for us to actually give a negative tax rate to people at the bottom. At the same time, we might take a little bit more from those at the top. And then if you lose a middle job and you get demoted, you'll still get some higher wage than you would have otherwise because of these negative tax rates. So I think there are things that we can do to make people's lives better and easier when these transitions come. But I think blaming it all on trade is silly because there's all sorts of things that cause people to lose their jobs. Like, there was a study of the China shock, which said, maybe 2 million jobs were lost. Well, you know how many jobs are lost every quarter in the United States? It's more like 7 million, right?
Wow.
So capitalism creates an enormous amount of job loss and job creation. There's a lot of job creation too. But there's a lot of churn just because of capitalism, right? And capitalism comes with some great things, but we have to make sure that we're providing a safety net for those who get hurt by this churn, and that we're providing paths to the next job, right? Whether it's community college or infrastructure, or access to broadband internet, those kinds of things. And those are the kinds of investments people should focus on. I think putting a big sales tax on lower income people is not the answer, unfortunately.
Right. Sure. As you rightly said, capitalism creates jobs, but it also destroys jobs. But when it comes to certain things that are strategically important, such as semiconductors, right? So yeah, maybe we could understand why the US wants semiconductor to be produced at home. But even that, what can you say?
Yeah, so I think with industries that are strategic, first you have to ask, why is it strategic? Is it truly strategic? So semiconductors, yes, they probably are truly strategic. And then you have to ask the second question, well, what is the best way to encourage that? Does it need to be made in your country? If so, right, then maybe you can subsidize domestic production. But sometimes it's more that you just don't want to be vulnerable to cut off from any particular trading partner. So let's say you're worried that an adversary has a monopoly on a good that you need that's a vital input to something that you have to make, right? You would want to de-risk and diversify and make sure that you can get access to this input, but it doesn't, not everything has to be made at home. Sometimes you just have to be careful that you're not, exposing yourself to risk, and especially geopolitical risk if you're not getting along with the country that has the monopoly. So I think that's one issue. And then there's some things we might just want to make, right? And countries subsidize things all the time. And I think a subsidy is a pretty effective way to do it, because then you can see how much you're spending to try to get this. You can say, okay, well, the CHIPS Act spent $50 billion trying to encourage US chip production. We can see that. But then we can also see whether the US chips meet the standard of world markets, because they're all going to be traded at the same price. Whereas if we put up these tariff barriers, right, then we're creating like an inefficient American market that doesn't have to meet the test of world markets. So a subsidy is a much better way to help those strategic industries, because you're kind of recognizing the cost, you're not hiding them. And you have this market test mechanism where you can see, well, did they end up making something that could meet the test of world markets or not? They just need more and more subsidies, right? And then so the government has to kind of face it, as opposed to kind of these non-transparent hidden costs.
Right. Kim, I know that you teach tax law, so why don't I try to pick your brain on that? So recently, there's a lot of talk on giant having to pay tax wherever you are. Global firms are always evading tax. So what do you say to that? Should there be an coordinated, fully cooperated international taxing system that go after those giants wherever they operate?
Yeah, so I'm a supporter of international cooperation on issues surrounding taxing the multinational company income, in part because I think otherwise we have this sort of free rider problem through tax competition, where countries will try to undermine each other's tax bases and attract mobile capital, right? And we saw that problem getting really large over the first couple decades of this century, in part because of regime competition. In addition to rate competition, countries could create loopholes such that you could create income if you were a US multinational that wasn't taxed anywhere. I just think it's not sensible to allow all of that income to escape taxation. We don't tax capital income mostly at the individual level in the United States. Most of it's exempt. Right. So your only bite of the apple is at the firm level. Those firms that are most successful are the multinational firms. So if you give up on taxing them, you can't really have a fair tax system. But to do that well, you really need some coordination. And I think there was a project that resulted in this 2021 agreement, the pillars, that was a big, important step towards that cooperation. I don't think it's done. Like, I think we need more to strengthen that agreement and to get all the key stakeholders on board. The United States right now is dragging its feet, to say the least. It's really trying to sink the agreement. But a lot of other countries are implementing the agreement, and I think they should hold firm and try to make the agreement better rather than weaker, because this is the problem that's not going to go away. And if countries want to protect their sovereign ability to raise taxes as they see fit, they're going to need to work together. And it's a similar argument to one we might make around climate change, like Cambodia or Japan or Denmark. Those countries can't solve climate change by themselves, even if they had the perfect policies, right? It's a global problem, and it requires us to think cooperatively about how to best address it, and not just kind of let everybody do what's right for them, because then too little will get done in the climate space, and tax rates will be too low in the multinational space.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you very much. I think it has been a tremendous pleasure. Now, let me just put up my final question to you. This is the, as we all talking about tariff everywhere. Well, Cambodia right now, I think we have like 19 rate.
Sorry about that.
Right. So what would you say to all these countries that suddenly wake up to new tariff to import?
Yeah.
To the US, what would be your advice with this new rate of tariffs?
Yes, so I think the best thing that foreign countries can do is to work together at this time to preserve a free and open trading system among themselves, and to bracket the United States. Like, the United States is doing this dumb experiment. Hopefully we'll learn our lesson of inflicting our harm on ourselves. But the rest of the world has the advantage of having the rest of the world, right? Like, trade with the United States is going to be less than it used to be, but there's no reason not to trade with everybody else. There's some countries like Canada that are going to have a hard time replacing the United States very easily, because the United States is extremely important to Canada and Mexico. But aside from those two countries, like, most other countries have a lot of diversification in their trading relationships, and they can take comfort from the fact that this shock, while an important shock, doesn't have to be the way that they do things, right? So I think working together on plurilateral replacements for things that would otherwise be multilateral, to say, okay, well, what do we do? We're not going to let the US be a veto point, but we are going to work together in things like the CPTPP or the EU or whatever these these groups of nations are, and we're going to try to build links with each other, Mercosur, and RCEP, and there's all these different opportunities for countries to expand trade with each other, while the United States is doing its own thing for a bit. Like, you can't totally ignore the United States because it's a big player, but I wouldn't emulate the United States, because the United States is doing an unwise policy experiment at present.
Well said. Well, we started with your book, so I would have to end our conversation with your book, which my last question is, are you going to rewrite it or update it anytime soon?
Well, I would encourage people to still consider reading the version that I wrote. I think it's quite pertinent to the present moment. I think what I'm going to focus on in the short term is shorter pieces that get out faster, because so much is changing. We don't even know what the US courts are going to do with the tariffs, because the president's use of tariffs in the manner that he's been levying them is not consistent with the US Constitution. If you look at the Article 1 of the Constitution, it says Congress gets to do taxes, and there's only very narrow exceptions in which the president can do things. And this doesn't look narrow to any lawyers that I know. So this is still working its way through the courts. It could take as much as another year to resolve. But I wouldn't want to write another book that's contingent on like a certain outcome when we don't really know how this story is going to end. But I will be writing much shorter pieces. I have a website at the UCLA that you can look at, and there's both research papers but also shorter commentary. So that might hold over some of your listeners before I get up the nerve to write another book.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Kimberly Clausing, UCLA. I hope you will come back. And in the meantime, we will continue to read your articles, to learn from you, your wisdom. So again, thank you very much. And I hope to see you very good sometime very soon. So good night to you. Thank you very much, Professor Kim.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye now.